What is up guys, Greedy Knight here talking about the raw attack meta and how it has affected Monster Hunter up until Sunbreak. I'll be going over what the meta is and why raw was dominant for a majority of the weapon roster. Let's get into it. The quote-unquote meta in Monster Hunter is the established notion that DPS builds are the most effective at killing the monster in the quickest amount of time. Your builds provide an increase in your damage, while your weapons combos dictate how fast and how often your attacks land. The build meta is determined by the math of your gear's damage applied on a given monster for every monster in a given game. The two types of DPS builds are element and raw builds. Element sets are designed to boost element and counter a monster's elemental weakness to inflict super effective damage, while raw builds are designed to boost raw damage and apply good damage across all monsters, regardless of elemental weakness. That begs the question, why are raw builds so dominant? Firstly, it is more resource efficient to spend materials on one weapon and one build versus 5 elemental weapons and 5 elemental builds, especially during a playthrough where materials and zenny are tight. Typically, elemental sets require 5 rare drops to get the final upgrade for weapons versus raw builds' single rare drop. Second, raw is the most effective set generally, while element is supposed to be the most effective set specifically. Raw builds serve as the benchmark for whether you run an element build. If the damage of your element build is lower than your raw build against a given monster, you will opt for the raw build. You won't bother with building the element set since it will cost materials and zenny for a non-positive return in that instance. The only time you swap to element is whenever the element set does more damage than the raw build. That's where you bust out the calculator and find out if the best element weapons can outperform the best raw weapons. For this reason, element weapons are typically reserved for endgame because the amount of investment required to maximize your damage, and you have to deal with the terrible RNG for mantles/orbs to craft said weapons. Lastly, several weapons are unable to capitalize on element when it's below a certain threshold, so you opt for raw regardless of the benefits of element sets. Damage-wise, the biggest contributor to your damage is the weapon, so you want to run the best weapons in the meta. The best raw weapon is pitted against the best element weapon in any given matchup. In practice, even if a weapon had additional stats like low element or status like blast, you can build it like a raw weapon if it had enough raw attack. You didn't prioritize element investment on these element but technically raw weapons. By contrast, the best element weapons had at least 40 element, but they were balanced to have lower than average raw attack. If Diablo's weapons had a true raw attack of 370, then good element weapons were often capped at a raw attack of 300, with a similar elemental cap of 50. Some element weapons had abysmal sharpness, requiring handicraft and razor sharp investment on top of element investment. It was a common case for an element to be lacking a good weapon line, forcing you to run a garbage stat weapon for said element or default to raw weapons. The next reason is the old Sharpness modifier. It was a large contributor to the raw build's success, specifically the purple Sharpness modifier. It started in the 3rd fleet with a massive value of 1.5 for raw attacks and 1.2 for element. In 4U, it was nerfed down to 1.45 for raw attack and maintained the 1.2 element multiplier. The race for purple was a prevalent pattern in the meta because of the massive raw multiplier, but element builds aim for purple to double dip for the element multiplier and the raw multiplier. Purple Sharpness emphasis was dialed down because the multiplier was nerfed down to the current 1.39 raw multiplier starting with Monster Hunter GU. This nerf brought raw damage closer in line with element, allowing element weapons to actually shine in later installments. Element is better in the 5th fleet because the element multiplier was buffed to 1.25, rewarding sharpness investment for element weapons more so than raw weapons. Motion values and multipliers dictate how effective raw and element are for a specific weapon type. Raw attack is applied by all weapons regardless of element, it's just a matter of whether it deals cutting, blunt, or pierce. Element is separated by fire, water, thunder, ice, and dragon. It is only applied when a monster has a non-zero element hit zone requiring one of each element to cover the entire roster because of elemental immunities. Usually element is a 1.0 multiplier, so 100% of your element goes into each of your attacks. The damage formula, in summary, is equal to raw damage plus element damage. Since element is a flat boost to your raw damage, the weapons that benefit the most from element have multi-hit moves. Each hit will apply your element damage in full, only being cut by elemental hit zones. Greatsword is traditionally a raw-centric weapon. It applies one high-value hit that primarily boosts raw damage. Any elemental increase would result in minimal returns, so it's optimal to drop element investment and focus on raw attack. In contrast, dual blades have low motion values with the 11-hit Demon Dance and a flurry of slashing combos. Element produces a flat boost to each hit, resulting in higher damage through element investment. However, exceptions to the multi-hit rule are weapon subtypes like shelling, foul types, and ammo types. These subtypes invested in whatever skill boosted its unique form of damage. For example, Element File focus entirely on element whilst ignoring crits, raw damage, and artillery. Shelling focus on artillery and respective food modifiers, while ammo types focus on boosting respective ammo damage like normal or spread. For optimal damage, the ideal elemental hit zone was 25+. This included a small cluster of the monster roster's elemental hit zones because most of them sat at the 20 element hit zone or lower. This meant that you had to target a specific hit zone in order to output maximum elemental damage. You could use element damage against 20 element hit zones, but the damage was closer to raw builds at this level in older games. Because the raw build served as the benchmark for good damage, you had to check if element did more damage in every given matchup. The 25 hit zone rule is just a common pattern for when an element build outshines a raw attack build, not a fixed law. Most of the time, 25 element hit zones are attached to 45 raw attack hit zones, typically located on the head. A few exceptions are Chaotic Gore Magala's arms, where it's resilient to raw damage and weak to element damage. In Sunbreak, this 25 element hit zone rule shifts down to 20 because the state of element is in a better position in that game. Anything below the 20 element hit zone range will allow raw builds to match or outperform element builds. The element cap is the limit of your base element. When your element is highlighted orange in your stat screen, that means you have reached the elemental cap. In older generations, the elemental cap was 120 of your weapon's base element. Investing into other skills like element attack up was a waste of points. You chose either a respective element boost or the generic element attack up skill. However, you ran element crit boost. It was not a boost to your base element, but a multiplier that was applied during crit calculation to bypass the elemental cap. Element performed better in the 5th fleet because Worldborn's cap is 160% of your base element, while Sunbreak has the cap set at 560 element. Basically, there was no functional cap for element in the 5th fleet because boost didn't reach the cap. It allowed weapons aside from dual blades to use element sets to their full potential. Mathematically, when element blows past the 60 element threshold, that is when element shines for more weapons aside from the multi-hit weapons like dual blades and bow. Crank it up to 200 element, every weapon will be in the element camp. In terms of pre-world boost, raw builds had more skills compared to element skills. Raw attack could be boosted by attack up, crit boost, agitator, peak performance / resentment, and Dragonheart to list a few raw skills. In comparison, up until Monster Hunter World, element had a respective element boost for fire, water, thunder, ice, and dragon, a generic element up, and element crit up. It was 6 boosts versus 3. It's no wonder that element was outclassed by raw builds for most weapons because you can raise raw attack damage far more than element damage. In addition, armor sets were limited in space. You could not get your raw skills, element skills, or functional skills all on one set. You had to prioritize the biggest boost and drop the lowest boost. Dual blades dump raw attack in favor of element investment and crits, while weapons like Greatsword drop element in favor of raw attack and crits. In World, it was a similar skill lineup, but there was the addition of the elemental augments and overhaul of the armor system, allowing you to slot in everything without having to trade off anything. As for what changed in Risebreak, a lot of the raw attack skills got elemental skill equivalents along with the conjoined skills like Dereliction and Mail of Hellfire. Despite all the changes in the 5th fleet, raw builds are prevalent for most weapons in World Iceborn because of the Clutch Claw. It has a tenderizing mechanic that increases the hit zone by the following formula. The higher your hit zone is, the lower the boost. The lower your hit zone is, the higher the boost. However, it only applies to the raw side of hit zones, cutting, blunt, and pierce. It does nothing for element, meaning that the Clutch Claw inflated the power of raw attacks to consistently output more damage than element. Paired with the fact that several monsters in Iceborn have terrible elemental hit zones, it made element a subpar build for most weapons. To curb the dominance of raw sets, they made Elatrion's Eschaton Judgment wipe the party if you didn't deal enough element damage by forcing you to run element weapons. So that was the only time element was the meta strategy in a fight. Every other monster emphasized raw builds using Fatalis / Raging Brachiosaurus for the usual raw build culprits. The usual element weapons doubled down on respective builds, but Element Foul Charge Blade became an element-centric weapon type with the addition of Savage Axe and its buzzsawing multi-hits. Kajara weapons carried the element builds with its natural crit element boost and high elements values. Weapons like Elatrion, Safi'jiiva, and Furious Rajang were used for Fatalis mix sets. Then why is Sunbreak the exception to the raw attack dominance of older games? I've detailed it in this video linked down below, but basically Capcom leveled the playing field. Every element got a good weapon line with a minimum of 300 attack and white sharpness. The sharpness modifier was changed to nerf raw attack and buff element at the purple sharpness level. Motion values and multipliers were tweaked to balance both sources of damage. Most raw skills now had an elemental equivalent. The new world skill system let you grab everything ranging from raw attack, crits, element, and functional skills. The elemental cap was effectively removed, and the augment system paired with the new element skills let every weapon craft 250 element, making Risebreak the highest element in the series of Monster Hunter. Every weapon that could apply element to their damage output bent the knee to element for optimal damage. Shelling Gunlance and Impact Foul Super Spam Charge Blade ignored the element meta, but they were outclassed by their elemental counterparts. The only weapon that is a bastion of raw builds is the Great Sword. In spite of having an element-centric surge / playstyle, time attackers will opt for the true charge / playstyle because it outputs more damage as a raw build. Like if this video was useful to you, consider subscribing if you want to see more discussions like this. That's all I got for this one. Greedy Knight, signing out.